Hello there. Hi, everyone. Mia here from Resonance Astrology, and welcome to my podcast. I'm so excited having you here. I'm recording this on May 15th, 2024 at 16:42 Central European Time. This is part of the 12th house series, which I'm doing every month, and this month we will be taking a look at the second house in astrology. So before I fully dive in, I would just really like to quickly preface that I use whole sign houses and I have more of a ancient Hellenistic approach when I do things. And if you want to hear me talk more in depth about why I choose to follow that path and, have a bit of a longer introductory section, you can all find this in the first episode where I talk about the first house. There's like a whole section where I get a bit more into the houses and how they are formed because it is so much related to the first house and the ascendant. So please check that out. And like I also make a distinction there between whole sign and Placidus, which are arguably the most commonly used house systems. But yeah, in the whole sign house system, we follow the path of taking the whole sign, so the 30 degrees of a sign, and putting it into one house. But again, more on that in the first episode. Go give it a listen. Um, and the house division debate is one of the longest ongoing debates in astrology, and there are just so many thoughts and opinions on what the right house system is to use. I have, for multiple reasons, settled on the whole sign house systems, but I just think it's very important to notice or tell you this in that sense because, yeah, every astrologer uses different house systems or techniques. And especially if you are getting a reading from someone, I think it's really important that you know which house system they are using because you might get a different house division. Planets might fall into different houses. So I always tell people when I'm giving a reading that I'm using a whole sign house system because even in my case, when I switch back and forth from Placidus and whole sign, like every single planet is in a different house. So in my case, it really, really gives it a whole set of different variations. So I just think it's very important to say that. And to, you can also go and Google it yourself. Just type in birth chart whole sign houses. On many sites, you can actually just put in your birth chart and then you can click which house system you want to use. There are many more than just whole sign and Placidus, actually. There's a lot more house systems out there for different purposes. So I just wanted to mention that because I think, again, it's so, so, so important. Um, what I also want to mention every time before I fully dive in is that while I am doing the 12th houses during the 12 months, I am doing this for convenient purposes, and not because I correlate the 12 houses to the zodiac signs. There is something we call astrology ABC, where people have correlated the first house to the first sign. So you would go like first house equals Aries, or is the Aries house and is the Mars house, and then the second house is the Taurus house, and so on and so forth. I don't do that, even though I am following the 12 houses in the sense you could say through the zodiac signs. I'm not correlating them together, and I can only highly suggest that you separate the houses and the signs as well, because when I did that, the houses finally started making sense. I had a bit of a rough time before that, so I can only highly recommend it. And I am also doing like a mini series on the side where I'm talking about the planets and empty houses and so on and so forth. And for the first house, I did it with the zodiac signs and the planets, but I think this time around I will just be sticking to the planets because I feel like you can just listen to the planets and that will also give you an insight. So, for example, if you are a Taurus rising, your second house is going to be Gemini in whole sign houses. So it's going to be ruled by Mercury. You might have other planets there, like you might have Venus and Mercury there, but you could just then listen to Venus and Mercury because that is just also going to give you insight. And I feel like it took like way too long to explain that and go through that. Um, so it took like way longer than I expected. And I feel like you get a good enough understanding by just listening to the planets and making the connections and following that path. So I'll be focusing more on that. And I also think it's so much interesting talking about the planets itself because you always come back to them, even if you have an if you are a Taurus rising and you have Gemini ruling your second house, so aka a Mercury ruled second house, and you have no planet there, you're going to still it's still going to be influenced by Mercury. So um and it's going to give it a flavor of Mercury. So really, I'm going to be focusing much more on the planets. I think it's just better. So I wanted to inform you that. Yeah, and I think now we can, go on with the second house. And the second house is the house that follows right after the first house. So you will find it in your birth chart on the left side, a bit below the middle, after the first house where your rising sign or ascendant is located. It's going to be a bit below that. The second house, or also the second place, is known as the gates of Hades. It's a succeedent house from the first angular triad that stems from the ascendant onwards. So every angular triad starts with an angular house, followed by a succeedent house, and then followed by a declining house. So the succeedent house is called like that because it's succeeding the angular house. If the ascendant moves into another sign, the second house would become the first sign. So we're focused on gain and building up things. You could, for example, if we take you are a Libra rising, well, if you would move the ascendant degree a bit by minute, you can do this in an app, for example, you would see that once the ascendant moves to the next sign, so Scorpio, which if you're a Libra rising, Scorpio is your second house, but then it would become your first house. You would become a Scorpio rising. So in a way, it's like a pre-ascension. Something is about to be gained, some significance. And like again, if you would have just been born a bit later, you would have taken upon that rising sign, and the succeeding house would become an angular house, gaining much more significant importance. So in a way, you could say that the succeeding houses are about the future. If the angular houses are more about the present, um, the declining houses are kind of about the past, and then the succeeding houses are more about the future because it's oriented about what is to come. So in the first house part, we also briefly talked about planetary joys, and the second house does not have any planetary joy. There is no planet in its joy there. So we can kind of skip that part here and we will focus more on that on the third house again, because the moon has its planetary joy there. And the second house or the second place also falls under the so-called bad places or bad houses. This is because it is in aversion to the ascendant. Any place that is configured to the first place or the first house and the rising sign is like a more favorable place. So houses that form aspects such as sextiles, trines, squares, and oppositions. But the second, the sixth, the eighth, and the 12th house do not form any such aspects, and therefore you could say are kind of hidden from the ascendant, hidden from the native, from the person having the birth chart. Because they are not seen, they are usually more unfavorable, or in that sense, just also difficult, or that this is the reason why they're called bad houses. Although it is very commonly agreed upon that out of the so-called bad places and difficult houses, the second house is by far the least difficult and harsh one, but more on that later. So another name, or what the second house was also often referred to, was bios, so life, livelihood, as it had to do with the physical gain of the native. So often we can see the second house in correlation with money, what we own, what we get, what we accumulate, and the resources that we have or that we gain. But is money really the only resource? And is it even the most important one? The second house is about our means of living. So, in a way, about the resources or how we go on about the resources we need to maintain life. So almost 2 years ago, and I did check it, and I was amazed that it was already so long ago. But I took a course from the lovely Diana Rose Harper that centered around the first and second houses, and it was called Fundamental Needs and Required Resources: The Collaboration of the First and the Second House. And it is a course I can only still recommend as it really deepened my understanding of the second house, which I personally kind of had a very hard or like a harder time understanding. I feel like some other houses were a lot clearer or easier to grasp for me, but the second house is honestly still it's one of the houses that I have just a harder time understanding or relating how it shows up in my life. But this course definitely really deepened that and made me rethink and also reflect on how it did show up, like how the transits showed up when I had a second house transit. And it also made me really rethink what my own resources are and what I view as bringing in value, and as well as what my needs are and like how I go on about getting those needs met. And like personal needs, I guess, are more like a first house topic. But since the second house falls into the triad, it is like a, and again, it is a succeedant to the first house. So it's in a way like, okay, the first house is like, this is me, this is what I need. And then the second house is like, okay, but how do I go on? What is my skill set? What do I bring to the table? What can I gain from this so I can make what I want and need a physical reality in my life? And it is obviously also very true that in our capitalistic society and world, money is a kind of at the center as a great resource, and it definitely can be. I don't want to like push it in the back or something like that. But so often the second house is really just also about the skills and what we are good at, that in exchange so often brings us money. So often the second house is about what we do for a living. It is also in a trine aspect to the 10th house, which is the house referred to our career, to our proxies, to what we are known for. So it positively influences that place. So if, for example, you have Mercury or Mercury ruled second house, it can mean that you're very good at talking and communicating, and that you end up earning money through being like maybe a counselor, a coach, a singer, a stand-up comedian, writer, like somewhere where you have to use your words and effectively communicate. Whereas, for example, a Saturnian ruled second house or the second house ruled by Saturn could mean that you're very skilled with one particular set of interests, usually something, as it is with Saturn, that gets better over time. So you get like extremely good and excel in something like agriculture, which is associated with Saturn, or like pottery, mining, being a watchmaker, things that take precise skills and are more hands-on, or people that are good at bearing the dark and harsher side of humanity and therefore have a skill at being good at working like maybe prisons or being healers, something like that. So as you see, the difference of the 10th house and the second house is more about what you're good at or develop over time, whereas the 10th house is what you're known for. But they do really also build on each other. That's why they are configured with a trine aspect. So you can see that so often this is how it ends up. Like we're known for the things that we are good at. We're working the careers with the skills that we gain over time, but it is not always the case. Sometimes I, think of people or perhaps difficult placements and planets that could you could end up making money from very different things than the things you get known for. Um, people that die and they're like known for being a famous singer or something like that, but then it gets discovered like, oh, they had all these other skills and they were also a painter and this and that or whatever. Or like, okay, this is what they're known for, but actually they were super bad with money. Something like that. That is also the other side. And this is also where we get a bit of a taste why the second house is called the gates of Hades or the gates of the underworld. There is a notion of descending into the material world and how sometimes this material world can, in a way, like entrap us. So we can see an interesting opposition correlation when we put like the second and the eighth house against each other, which are contrary. They're in opposition to each other. And the eighth house has to do, contrary to the second house, with other people's possessions and resources, other people's money, like the soul contracts and entanglements we have with other people. So in a way, the second house has much more to do with our own pitfalls. Since this is a succeedant house and has to do with gain, it can get out of control. We can get like addicted to the physical gain and pursuit of wealth. Money can turn against us. Our resources can harm us. Like things can just like grow sour, if we're just focused on gaining, gaining, gaining instead of like a more like an exchange. And the second house is also the last region that the planets travel through in the diurnal rotation before they rise again over the horizon. That's why everything below the ascendant and the descendant has, in a way, been correlated to some sort of underworld or like what's below the horizon. So the second place is, in a way, the last part and the gate of the underworld that the planets pass through before they would inevitably follow into the first house eventually. The association with Hades and the underworld also gives us an interesting insight or motive for financial matters, as in Greek mythology, Hades was also referred to as Pluto, and Pluto was associated with riches and wealth. The second place also signifies broadly that which follows after birth, like the birth itself is more like a first house process, but then like the incarnation, the flesh, right? Like incarne, in the flesh. That is inevitably you are born into the material and physical realm when you are incarnated. So the second house follows what the gain is, or what follows after that part where we get into the physical body when we are born. Since these are primary possessions as well, they can also signify things we are like born into, or in a way that are easier for us to accumulate because of the resources we got from the circumstances we were born into. Even though the fourth house has more to do with like family itself, you could say that the second house is a slight extension of that, or just like more of a focus on the physical circumstances you get set up with when you're born. So, for example, if you're born into more like a rich household, or if you are born with great teachers around you, parents that are known for some specific skill or like that, and actually that can lead to you having like an easier time gaining a certain skill because you were born into that family. Like if you are born into a rich household, it will obviously be easier for you to understand how to maybe do investing if your parents are good investors. Or if you are born with music teachers, it will be much easier for you to acquire the skill on how to play an instrument and therefore maybe become a music teacher yourself one day. So again, while it's not specifically the family itself, this is much more fourth housey. It has a lot also to do with the family because in a way, family itself is also a great resource, or can talk about how maybe also it is not a great resource, right? If it's a difficult afflicted or something like that, you could see like, oh, okay, there is like the family is not a resource at all, or they're not helpful at all, or they are of great asset to the person. They can really rely on them. Like in the ideal case, family is a resource you can rely on. So in that case, it also has to do with the family members and again, the circumstances you really get born into, which are so often something that is felt that is like outside of our control, or something we just need to learn to deal with. Like, okay, that's what I have. Since I was born inevitably, because I was born into this family, this is what I have. But then the extension would be, okay, what do I do with this? What do I want to gain further? What do I accept as, okay, this is my luck? And what are some further skill sets and other assets that we can, get into our lives? Or, sometimes if it's hard, because while the second house is about getting and gain, it can also be how we spend our money. It's about giving and receiving at the end. So it can sometimes also talk about a downfall or a pitfall. Like if there is a difficult second house transits, it might as well have to do with like, oh, I like a resource that I thought I would always have is taken away from me, or like a skill set that I had, I suddenly I can't do it anymore. Like it can very much also be with the physical body. So like, you get like an injury or an accident and it's like, okay, damn, like I took just walking for granted or something like that. Now my leg is broken. I can't just go anywhere where I wanted to. Something was taken away from me in that sense. Or if we go more towards the topic about money, right? Like maybe you have an investment and then you can clearly see, oh, it didn't work out. Like the investment didn't pay off. You lost all the money that you invested. A resource got taken away, a house got burned down. This is a great resource. Stuff like that. It can even show up as people, right? Like if you have, for example, a therapist is a resource, right? It could also show up as, okay, the therapist is going into retirement and now you have to find a new therapist and it's very difficult to find someone you can connect with as deeply as the first one. So really things like that. I want us to think about the second house in a much, much broader way, what like values and resources and possessions are, because while it is a lot about the material realm, if you have things that are more like not so tangible in the second house, for example, like maybe Neptune, things like that. Jupiter is also a gassy planet, maybe Mercury ruled first house. It's not always just about the physical possessions itself, or just like the things that you are good at because of these things can give you an easier time about accumulating the physical expressions of that. So another great word that I really like to use with the second house is cultivation. The second house is about what we cultivate and develop that supports our physical life. This really broadens the perception and also makes me come back to the initial question of like, is money the only valuable resource? Is it the only thing worth cultivating? It is really about anything that supports our physical existence, such as even what food we eat. And I already touched upon this before, but while the second house is about gain, it is so much about giving and receiving. Since the third word that was like associated with the second house, and I'm gonna butcher this, but it's like koinonia, which means something along the lines of like sharing, generosity, and charity. So it's really also what we do with the money, how we like to spend it, how we like to share and give the resources we have gained. Do we share our wisdom and knowledge? How generous are we? Do we even just share our kindness? A smile can be the greatest gift we can give to a stranger sometimes. And yet if it turns sour, we can get entangled and we can become like selfish and sluggish and lazy to give. Our possessions can get rotten if we are not willing to share, which is also why the second house can be a difficult place. It really is an invitation to think about what our wants and needs are and what we have to get or what we have to do to get these wants and needs met and turn them into our physical reality. And I feel like the second house, sometimes again, it's so interesting for me because again, I still have a harder time grasping it. I feel like it's in my case not so out there. In some people's lives, you can like really see it and it's prominent, but because there are just so many transits that like you don't really know until after that. It's like maybe you have a Jupiter transit in your second house, and then many people are like, "Oh my gosh, I'm like you're gonna get rich, you're gonna get rich," and that is one possible signification. But it does not have to be that. It can very much also just be that okay, if you're like gonna go study or you're gonna learn something, you get into a different sort of religious practice or something like that. And in that moment, it does like enrich you. It does also enrich your physical life. But then, like, only maybe later on, you realize, okay, because I stepped up and now like I belong to this different religious community. Now this gives me access and resources to then do this and this and this. And like with this, I can now make money or I'm resourced in a different way, I think it's so much about trusting that our needs are met in the end, and our needs are so individual. It's not all just about money. I mean, how many of us would be overwhelmed? I mean, a Jupiter transit in the second house could very much also be like, okay, you gain more money, but then, like, what do you do all of a sudden with this? What do you do all of a sudden if you actually do win on the lottery and you have been living all your life living paycheck to paycheck? It's like overwhelming. Jupiter can be very overwhelming, and it's not just super nice and easy. So it's like I really just want us to rethink that because everybody just thinks about like, oh, money and possessions, and these things are great, and they definitely belong to the second house. But it's also just it can be a difficult place. That's why it is a bad house at the end of the day, because it can entangle us. At the end of the day, physical gains and things we possess is something that is keeping us in the realm of this physical world. It's nothing that we take with us to the grave when we die, when we also leave our physical body, right? So it's just interesting how it can be just such an entangling house in a way, or things that maybe seem good, but can also be harsh. There is just definitely like a good and a bad side to any house, but just I really just want us to critically look at the second house and view it from many different lenses, because it really is just not about gaining financial wealth, even though, of course, I wish that to all of you. In the end, I just hope we all get exactly what we need. And I think the second house is really just about that, about getting what we exactly need in this life. And what we need might be completely different. And you can be rich in so many ways, not just with money and possessions, even though, of course, they can play a great role. But then again, it's like we only want to possess as many things that we can truly take care of. If we have three houses and 10 cars, but they are rotting in our garage, like, what is the point of them? But if you are a car lover and you really use them and you drive around with them, then it's like, why not? Why not? But that's kind of what the second house is about. It just really asks us these questions and invites us to really rethink, what is my want and need? What are my skills to acquire that? And how can I trust that there is also in some way some sort of plan that I will always get what I need, even if what I need is not always what I think that I need, or there, like, the universe goes on in different ways of getting these needs met. And sometimes we just kind of have to open our eyes and see clearly what is it trying to bring into our own lives, because we might kind of be blind to that. Okay, second house transit comes around, Venus second house transit. Okay, we meet someone, right? And then suddenly they became like I don't want to put people into being assets, but definitely friendships and relationships to other people is something that can be a great asset, or that leads us to uh landing a job or acquiring, like Venus second house transit, you meet someone and you start a course together. And then the way that you learn this new skill you acquired, for example, you went to a pottery course, and now all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I love pottery. And then it becomes a thing that, you open your pottery shop, and you become really, known for that. That's what you end up making money with. So I just want us to really broaden the senses of that. It's not something that always happens exactly then, but something that can lead to a gain. It's definitely always in some sort of way a gain. um and of course also like a giving and a receiving. So as much as the first house is about gaining money, it can also, or not just it can, it is also about how we spend our money, how we like to give and share the resources that we have with others, because that is super important as well. And I think that kind of concludes my talk on the second house. It's obviously a bit shorter than the first house talk, and also the part where I'll be talking through the planets in the second house will follow soon. I'm super excited to do this one because I think the transits really give even a deeper flavor. I mean, even all the examples I gave you just before, I think it already colored the second house in many different ways. So I really hope to give you even greater impressions on how transits can show up, or like how second house transits can show up in our lives. Um, so stay tuned for that. And I would really like to thank you for sticking around. I really appreciate it if you took the time and energy to listen, and I hope it was informative. I'm super grateful if you found this great. Then, feel free to share my podcast, feel to like the video. And if you want to stay in touch, please make sure to subscribe to Resonance Astrology Podcast on Spotify and YouTube. And if you enjoy the episode, please leave a like and share it if you found it useful. If you want to follow and contact me, you can also find me on Instagram at Resonance Astrology or my website, resonanceastrology.com. I am open for booking, but since I'm still starting out small, please reach out over Instagram DM or shoot me a mail at resonanceastrology@gmail.com. And we will find a time that works for both of us. So please stay tuned for the other parts. And I wish you a lovely and pleasant day. Bye.